Her name is Kiamante Peterson. You want to come up here, please? And she's going to perform a song. And part of what I'm trying to do with this is highlight some of our students and the people associated with our department. And she's agreed to come and sing a song for us, about 5 minutes, I think. And then I would also like to introduce our main speaker for today. Our main speaker is Dr. Yasmin Ramirez, and she comes to us from the Center of Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College in New York. I'm really excited to have her here. She is going to talk, the title of her talk is called The Iconography of Black and Puerto Rican Art Movements, the 1960s through the 1980s. It's a comparative study of arts, activism, and social change in New York City during the post-civil rights era. Dr. Ramirez is a visual arts researcher at the Center of Puerto Rican Studies in New York. She earned her PhD in art history from City University of New York in 2005. Her exhibition catalog essays include Parallel Lives, Striking Differences, Notes on Chicano and Puerto Rican Graphic Arts of the 1970s, and La Vida, the life and writings of Miguel Piñero in the art of Martin Wong. Again, I want to just thank you all for being here, and if you could just give, please, everybody, both our presenters today, just a welcome applause. So, can you turn this off so it's not in her face?
I don't know how to do it.
Oh, can you turn it off just so it's not in her face? And then Yasmin will start with her talk after Kiamante performs her song.
Yeah.
Okay? Thank you.
Hello. I'm Kiamante. I'm a Black Studies major. Before I was a Black Studies major, I was a music major, and I found myself always attracted to like protest songs. I was a jazz vocalist major. And there are quite a few artists that I really like, and they often sing songs that have to do with civil rights or like the anti-racist movement. And I think what she's going to speak about is how art has played a role in that as well. So I'm going to sing a song that was written by Duke Ellington and performed by Mahalia Jackson. It's called Come Sunday, and it's basically a song of encouragement to people who are dealing with racism, and Sunday symbolizes the day that all this will hopefully be overcome. Oh, dear Lord, I love God Almighty, God above. Please look down and see my people through. Lord, dear Lord of love, God Almighty,
Somebody knows our every care. Go to him in secret. He will hear your every prayer. From dawn till sunset, men work hard all day. Come Sunday, oh, come Sunday, that's the day.
Thank you very much. Keep on. I needed to hear that. So, with that, I'd like to introduce Yasmin Ramirez.
Thanks very much for inviting me today. I'm really honored to be here. The work that I've discussed with you, some of the work that I've been doing on recovering Black and Latino art of the 90s.
Louder. Thank you.
Is that right? Is that better?
Hasn't worked yet. Left channel.
I recently finished my dissertation on, it's called New Rican Vanguards, A History of Puerto Rican Artists in New York from 1964 to 1984. I basically finished that only last year. So, more?
Put the mic down or stand it.
Okay. Yes. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. I'm not some of these like big, strong women here in Oregon. Little person from the Caribbean. So yeah, I finished my dissertation on Puerto Rican artists in New York, New Rican Vanguards, just last year, and I'm now largely involved in archiving the papers of the Puerto Rican artists and poets that I wrote about. I think as many of you know, archiving and research work can be a lonely process. But now there's a cadre of art historians like myself. Most of us are in our mid-30s and 40s. We're sort of like a between generation. People who grew up in the 1960s and kind of know these artists basically by interacting with them, by going to some of the small exhibitions at the alternative centers in New York. And we are kind of trying to be introduce them to a whole new generation of younger artists who may not have been able to see their work during the time that they were active. So at the present time, several of us in the Academy are involved with the Chicano Studies Research Center on a project called Abel. That's okay. many of us, for example, Kelly Jones of Yale University, Dr. Chon Ramirez of Chicano Studies Research Center, Alejandro Ramirez, who is a Cuban art historian, but who also does a lot of Puerto Rican and Dominican art. We all belong to sort of a group of art historians and archivists who are contributing to a new project being spearheaded by the Chicano Studies Research Center in UCLA called AVED, Revisioning Art History. And what we're working with Minnesota University Press and contacting young scholars or anyone who can write up on the art of the 1960s and 70s. And we're also involved in archiving the papers of artists at our various research centers, because many of these artists have not been collected by museums, or what exists in museums is actually quite small. So at this moment, there's a lot of activity going on behind the scenes in the Academy and in the field of curatorial studies on the kinds of work that African American and Latino artists were producing in the 1960s. But it's going to take about 5 years, at least, between 5 and 7 years, for our work to make its way into the public through books and surveys and even websites. So in the meantime, it's through looking at, it's through talks like this, and also by looking at contemporary art, we can begin to address the legacy of the 1960s and 70s. Since younger artists of color are also doing a great deal of work to draw attention to the importance of this generation who are active in the anti-war and civil rights struggles. And they're doing this sometimes by reprising, reconstructing the work of this generation. So on the screen, what you're looking at is a peace tower. What's called the Peace Tower, created in 2006. Right now, it's up at the Whitney Museum of American Art as part of the biennial. It's been reconstructed by a much younger conceptual artist whose name is Rican, who was born in Argentina, but he's of Thailand background. And a lot of his work throughout the last 7 years has tried to address collective activity among artists. One of the things that Rican began doing, being from Thailand and knowing that we basically know about Thailand culture through its food, he got grants, for example, to serve food at his openings. But also, not only for him, but other artists to serve food and to share food. Even though these kinds of things may seem a little odd that they would be funded by the art world, he actually has been very influential in trying to create a community of younger artists who want to serve community in some ways. At the actually at the Venice Biennale about 2 years ago, Rican also worked with the art historian Molly Nesbitt, who was my mentor. And they put together an exhibition called Utopia Station, a very, very large exhibition of activist art from the 1960s and 70s. This was not so well received, unfortunately, by the critical people that be. They thought it was really messy and it was uncurated. But nevertheless, that was in 2004. That was sort of the first kind of intervention that they made on the international scene to reprise some of the work of the 1960s and 70s. It was a very large exhibition that took place in Venice. So this third thing here that you see is a peace tower that he did with sculptor Mark de Subero. And they asked about 120 artists to contribute artwork that protests the U.S. intervention in Iraq. The tower stands as both a contemporary anti-war monument and as a monument to artists that participated in the civil rights and anti-war struggles in the 1960s, because it is a recreation of a similar tower that was erected by Mark de Subero in 1966 in Los Angeles. And the other piece that you're seeing is the original Peace Tower of 1966. For those of us who are historians of the 1960s, the Peace Tower is a touchstone or starting point of artist activism in the United States. As early as 1965, artist groups were simultaneously formed in New York and Los Angeles to protest the Vietnam War. These groups combined efforts and created a national coalition called Artists and Writers Protest. The first major action in New York was an anti-war statement that was signed by 407 artists and writers that was printed in the New York Times on April 18, 1965. In June 1965, artists collaborated with the Protest Committee of Los Angeles to publish a second open letter that objected to the Vietnam War and the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic. The second letter was published in the New York Times on June 27, 1965, and was signed by 579 artists and writers. The Los Angeles Protest Committee organized a national artist demonstration that included building that peace tower that you see here, which stood on a vacant lot on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. Over 400 artists from New York, Los Angeles, and Europe donated works that were sold for the tower's construction. Among the artists who participated in this were very well-known artists, I think, to anyone who studies art history of the 1960s, such as Roy Lichtenstein, Robert Motherwell, Louise Nevelson, Donald Judd, Ad Reinhardt, and Jim Rosenquist. Although Mark DeSubero is often credited with building the tower, it's also the co-creation of Mel Edwards, an African-American sculptor. And there he is forging some of his ironwork, who collaborated with DeSubero on the tower's design. And here you can see some of the work that Mel Edwards does. Mel Edwards is a very, very well-regarded sculptor. You can see some of his public works, usually in the South. He works a lot with iron. That's his primary material. And there's a lot of, he uses chains. He incorporates chains often in his work. And they're, on the one hand, chains, nails, other symbols about that may remind you of being martyrdom, being oppressed. And on the one hand, they reference slavery, obviously. But they also reference the kind of work that you will see from the Congo people in Africa. And these are power objects called enkisis, in which you'll see figures that are pierced with nails, but that is not necessarily a symbol of oppression, but is in fact a power object. In other words, when somebody is asking for help, you may pound that nail to draw the spirits to help you. So it's both a symbol of oppression, which is work, but it's very much also a power object, and it's that ambivalence that he plays with. Again, he's well known and collected primarily in the South. There's some works of his, smaller works like these. This is actually about maybe 3 feet large, and it usually hangs on a wall. But he certainly hasn't received the kind of major commissions that someone like Mark DeSubero has received, nor the kind of public support. So when art historians, mainstream art historians for the most part, think about the Peace Tower, it's really someone like Mark DeSubero that's given credit, and Mel Edwards falls outside of the historical record. The one art historian, I think, if you want to read more about this period, who is very, very sensitive to this issue, her name is Lucy Lepard. She was an activist during that time, and I would say her books are the ones that I rely on most, because she is a white North American woman. I think that she also might be of Jewish descent, but I can't be certain. I've never really asked her. She's now living actually in Arizona, here in the West, and working a lot with Native American artists. But she's written about 20 books, and if you take surveys of American art, you will definitely read her works. So, getting back to our story. Anti-war activism in the arts community in New York sprang to life with the Angry Arts Week of 1967, a week-long program of activities that raised public consciousness about the human cost of the Vietnam War. Organized by the coalition Artists and Writers Protest, the Angry Arts Week reputedly drew 6,000 spectators to attractions like the Caravan of Angry Artists, a performance troupe that traveled around the city on a flatbed truck, and also the collage of indignation, a sprawling collective work created by over 75 artists that was exhibited at NYU's Loeb Student Center. The Angry Arts Week was the beginning of a 5-year period of collective organizing among artists that brought vast changes to the New York art world. Besides the artists and writers' protests, other artist-run organizations dedicated to social change sprung up in New York. In 1968, African-American artists such as Faith Ringold and Tom Lloyd and Camille Phillips founded the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition to bring the problem of racial and gender discrimination in the art world to wider attention. The group BECC was formed in protest to an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Harlem on My Mind. This was in 1968. Extremely, did you see it? Okay.
I remember that there was.
Okay. One of the great things about that exhibit, it was sort of the first even attempt by a major museum to document something about Black American art in Harlem. It was an important exhibition, but it got protested, one, because they did not really involve any African American scholars in it. There were curators, there were scholars that they could have consulted. After that, one of our great art historians, who is now Director Emeritus of the Studio Museum, Dr. Lowry Sims, very important writer, you should definitely look her up. She got hired after that exhibition because of the protests. But they thought that the exhibition, number one, was badly curated. It was largely of photographs. It did bring to public attention the work of a now master of studio photography named James Van Der Zee. That was the first time that James Van Der Zee's work was ever given public attention, and since the 1960s, he has really entered sort of the canon of photography in the United States. But they did not make any attempt to really include some of the contemporary artists that were right there, active and moving, people like Faith Ringold. And this work is part of her Flag series called The Flag is Bleeding. And perhaps, one of the reasons that people like Faith Ringold and Tom Lloyd were not included in the exhibition is the politically loaded nature of the work. And also that, unfortunately, at that time still, art historians preferred to work with artists who are really elderly or near death, people who are not going to talk back to them. They're going to be grateful, they're going to stay in their place. I mean, I'm not saying James Van Der Zee is a very dignified gentleman. I had the opportunity when I was about 15 years old, and I used to do a lot of photography, to meet him. And it was unbelievable experience. He was probably in his late 60s by then, a very gentle, dignified man. So in any case, Faith Ringold, whom you also might know her work, she does now, much better known for creating quilts, story quilts of the African American experience, but they're also politically charged, but they're certainly not as difficult to look at, and I apologize for the kinds of, for the fuzziness of the slides, but that's part of the problem about the underdocumentation that I'll talk about later. And what it depicts is a woman there with two figures, and this particular one references the loss of a mom, of her children in the Vietnam War. And she made about 20 of these kinds of images of the flags bleeding with blood in the early 1960s, and that's how she became famous. Later on, she began to do the story quilts. And some of her story quilts, for example, incorporate masters like Van Gogh, like the work of Van Gogh, but he's meeting up with contemporary activists and artists like herself. So she'll picture herself with Van Gogh and his sunflowers, and he's gathered around the picnic table with people like Shirley Chisholm, Harriet Tubman. So these are wonderful works, and I hope that you might be able to remember her name, Faith Ringold. Perhaps the most radical artist organization in New York was the Art Workers Coalition. As the name suggests, the Art Workers Coalition was loosely based on a model of a labor union and spoke up for artists' rights and other causes. The Art Workers Coalition's wide-ranging agenda reflected its status as an umbrella organization for different factions of the arts community. Membership consisted of artists who were active in the anti-war movement, women and minority artists who sought to end institutional discrimination, and artists who wanted greater control over the display and sale of their works in galleries and museums. What brought all the artists together was the understanding that the New York art world structure mirrored some of the worst aspects of American society. It was male-dominated, racist, and ruthlessly capitalistic. Artists were treated as cogs in a system that reaped financial benefits from their labor. As Lucy Lepard articulated in the Art Workers Coalition, Not a History, which is an essay, a very famous essay on that period, the Art Workers Coalition members reasoned that they could be more effective at changing society by concentrating their efforts on reforming the sector over which they had the most influence, namely the art world. This is a quote. Certainly, it's everybody's individual choice as to how he or she is going to handle the political burden. Although anyone so sheltered as to believe that they have no such political burden is in for a shock. The AWC will be powerful only in the art field where artists have power. And it seems right to me that if an artist is more involved in the peace movement than in the artists' rights movement, he or she should be working directly with the movement. In other words, this is referring to some of the dialogues artists had about how effective things like building a peace tower and putting up these posters around, in student cafeterias, like there's one downstairs. How really effective is that? And some artists actually took time off from their work and just joined the movement directly and said, if I'm going to be there, then I have to just participate as a person who's going to be either fundraising or attending protests and basically going down south and retiring from artwork altogether. That's the decision some people made. Quote, I'm going to continue with what Lucy Lepard said. What anyone can do via the Art Workers Coalition for the Black Panthers or the Peace Movement or for Welfare Mothers can be done 100 times better within those organizations specializing in those fields. As an artist, however, we can exert an influence on those institutions which they depend on for their life, to make them speak up and to influence others. The fact that these institutions are run by people running areas of the larger world makes artist actions all the more important. And what they were talking about was Governor Rockefeller, who was not only governor, comes from a very rich man, but was also the trustee of the Museum of Modern Art, of which received many, many protests during that time. Over the spring of 1969, the Art Workers Coalition began holding weekly open meetings at an alternative space called Soho, Project for Living Artists. The card reports that anywhere from 60 to 100 artists attended the meetings to hammer out a platform for museum reform. In addition to the meetings, the AWC staged numerous protests at the Museum of Modern Art and other institutions across the city. After a year of demonstrations and discussions, the AWC created a 9-point list of demands to museums that was finalized in March of 1970. The resolutions, which sought a radical restructuring of museums, encouraged cultural democracy and called for the following policy changes. 1, museum boards of trustees are to be made up of 1/3 staff, 1/3 patrons, and 1/3 artists. Free admission at all times and extended hours to accommodate working people. 3, decentralization of all major museums through the creation of branch museums and programs that Black, Puerto Rican, and other communities can identify with and control. 4, the reservation of gallery spaces in all museums for the exhibition of Black and Puerto Rican artists. 5, equal representation of the sexes in all exhibitions and acquisitions. 6, public access to artist registries. 7, museum personnel responsibilities to include the protection of artists' rights and welfare. 8, exhibition programs that prioritize artists not currently represented by commercial galleries, and 9, artist retention control of their work, whether owned by them or not, to ensure that it is not altered, destroyed, or exhibited without their consent. Now, I know that these sound radical, but the museum did make some concessions. I mean, probably the one legacy that's left from the AWC that's being undermined at this moment is this notion of extended hours. In New York, and I don't know any other in other cities, in New York, museums regularly were opened at 9, closed at 5. There was no such thing as extended hours for people. There was no accommodation of children and group tours. There was no outreach to underserved communities, to any communities. It was very much, you go to the museum, it's a quiet temple for contemplation. And because of the AWC, we now have, I think throughout this country, at least one night a month where the museum is open until 11 or 12. And this notion of free admission on some nights. There was no such thing as free admission in museums prior to the AWC really demanding it. In fact, I mean, their first demand was that museums should be open 24 hours, all day. but that didn't really work out. But I would say right now, unfortunately, even the issue of free nights is really being curtailed. For example, the Whitney Museum of Art, which used to have weekly extended hours and weekly free nights, is now down to once a month. Admission to that museum is $17.50. The Guggenheim Museum is about $20 to see, and they also went down to one night a month where you can visit the museum for free. And the Museum of Modern Art they're still doing once a week nights of extended hours with free admission, but you're talking lines around the block. The Brooklyn Museum, we have one night a month where the galleries are open until 11 o'clock, and that's a free night. And the way that the museums kind of make up that money is by overcharging you on drinks and but it's there, but it is being undermined. And now these nights are very much tied to corporate interests. For example, free night brought to you by Target or Walmart or something like that, where it's a little unfortunate that it's very much entered into this come to the museum to be entertained rather than to be enlightened and to be taught. But that's the way that things have gone so far. So, Puerto Rican Artists and the Art Workers Coalition missing in action. The AWC's list of demands reflects the impact of African American, Puerto Rican, and women artists in the coalition. However, Rafael Montañez Ortiz, that's,
It's going to take a second.
okay, we'll keep going. Rafael Montañez Ortiz, who belonged to the AWC Decentralization Committee, is the only Puerto Rican artist whom scholars mentioned in connection with the AWC. The names of the other members of the Puerto Rican Art Workers Coalition, Adrian Garcia, Marcos Dimas, Martin Rubio, Armando Soto, Carlos Osorio, and Manuel Megoltero, and no, there were not any women in this, do not appear in either Lupard or Francis Francina's detailed accounts of the AWC's history. Furthermore, neither scholar has drawn parallels between the Art Workers Coalition call for a decentralization of museums and the social movement led by African American and Puerto Rican parents to decentralize the New York City school system, a battle that was waged between 1967 and 1969. This was a very, very important battle for. And that's a picture of Ralph Ortiz, and I'll get to his artwork in a minute. What he's doing is he's just drawing a piano. Yes. So I think that anyone who knows the period of the 1960s in New York, the social history, knows that the decentralization movement was highly contested. You are talking about, when I read accounts during my dissertation of the New York Times of the kinds of protests that parents led to take control, local control of their schools and to introduce Black and Puerto Rican studies. You're talking about 2 years of warfare in New York on this issue. At the same time, you also had the institution of Head Start. I mean, it was a time of, in some sense, quite a bit of chaos. And at that time, at least, people started having, for example, freedom schools, where they just took their children out of schools and homeschooled them for a while. But there was also a great deal of change within that system. People felt empowered. People felt they could talk back. Indeed, because African Americans and Puerto Ricans presented a united front on so many issues, this has led scholars to assume that differentiating between the two communities is unnecessary. That's unfortunate because there were some important differences. Secondly, the school decentralization movement was highly controversial. The media and the United Federation of Teachers unfortunately represented African American and Puerto Rican parents as racial separatists, who were biased against the Jewish and white teachers that composed the majority of the city's teaching staff. And that was also another issue that they were calling for, much greater numbers of recruitment for Puerto Rican and black teachers at that time. And I think that effort was also successful. Understandably, artists at that time did not want to draw attention to the parallels between the two decentralization movements, since that could be seen as counterproductive to gaining support for the AWC's progressive agenda. So I'm going to really concentrate a little bit on the life history of Ralph Ortiz, who was the founder of El Museo del Barrio. Very, very influential figure, actually, in the 1960s, and whose name has been omitted by both the mainstream accounts, but also by Puerto Ricans, and you'll learn why, because his work was just too radical at the time. So he was the founder, but was ousted within 2 years of creating the museum. Excuse me? It's okay. I'll go there. Ralph Montañez Ortiz was born on January 30th, 1934 in Brooklyn. Well, let me just read this first. I mean, the reason that I'm focusing on him is because not only was he the most well-recognized Puerto Rican artist of the 1960s, Ralph Montañez Ortiz's life is quite common in what I found when I was interviewing about 30 artists. His life history is very similar to what many other Puerto Rican artists faced who were trying to gain entry into the mainstream museums and gallery system at the time. So Ralph Montañez Ortiz was born in January 30th, 1934 in Brooklyn, New York. His family moved to the Lower East Side when he was 2 years old. As a Puerto Rican child in a neighborhood then heavily populated by Eastern European Jews, Ortiz recalls of facing many biases. Quote, "I did not sense prejudice so much as disapproval," stated Ortiz. There was this myth of the Puerto Rican underclass as being louder and rowdier and hanging out in the streets with our bongas, yelling, screaming, fighting, and blaring the radio, which the media perpetuated. We had to prove ourselves, which we did pretty quickly, and within a couple of years we had respect in the community. Ortiz said that his parents were very much about assimilation. They did not speak Spanish at home. He went to school regularly. They emphasized education and to follow the American dream. So he was very much pulled in that direction of fitting into societal norms and into the neighborhood in which he grew up. Ortiz was initially exposed to art through programs sponsored by the Educational Alliance on East Broadway and settlement houses on Madison and Henry Street. His fairly pleasant boyhood experiences on the Lower East Side ended when he reached middle school and began to confront institutional prejudice. His early ambition was to become an architect, and when he applied to the High School of Music and Art, which graduated students with academic diplomas, he was steered against going there by his advisors. Although he passed the entrance exams for the High School of Music and Art, his guidance counselor placed him in the High School of Industrial Arts, a vocational school that was mostly populated by Puerto Rican and African Americans. Ortiz later discovered that students of color were practically barred from attending the High School of Music and Art because educators assumed that minorities could not excel in this competitive environment. And what I can tell you from my life experience is that the same thing happened. This story of the artists that I interviewed, who were colleagues with Rafael Ortiz, it was the same story, time and again. All of them wanted to go to the Music of Art, the High School of Music and Art. And all of them were told, you really shouldn't go there, that is not for you. I myself, who graduated from high school in 1977, I was sent, but my guidance counselor told my mom to send me to Bensonhurst, which was this school called Lafayette. It's sort of like the, it was like in Welcome Back, Kotter, and like Saturday Night Fever, that kind of neighborhood. And you know, I probably fit in great there, right? So yeah, it was really bad. That's when I started cutting school and going to art like museums and art events or whatever. But after a year of being there, I really discovered that there was like this alternative school called Dewey, which was like literally the same train stop, but on the other side. And I tried to go there. And the guidance counselor told my mother, you know, Yasmin is really special here. She's doing well and she has a high percentile. But if you sent her there, she'd be like everybody else and she wouldn't be special. So I suggest you keep her here. And I gotta tell you that when I was like denied even trying to go to that school, that's when I gave up myself. And I didn't even go to college until I was 25 because it's very like, you know, you're dejected if they don't even let you try. And if they tell your parents, don't let her try. You know, just keep her here. And, you know, I took like accounting. I really thought that I was going to be an accountant or something like that. You know, just be a secretary. And sometimes, you know, when my career isn't going the way I want, I'm like, I'm just going to like be a secretary. Why didn't I choose that? But you know, I'm here with you now, and I feel great. So this is what Ralph told me about his experience. Quote, I was interested in going to music and art high school. That is where all the middle class kids went. And vocational arts is where us underclass kids went, because supposedly we were not that smart. So there I was wanting to go to music and art, and my counselor said, no, 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 you go to industrial arts. And I could not figure that out because I took the test for music and art and I passed it. I was not sure what that was about. But clearly, now I see that it was a result of bias. Why? Because when I got to industrial arts, I saw that a third of the students were Latinos, another third were African American, and another third were Euro-Americans. So it was 2/3 students of color, underclass. Among all the Latinos and African Americans, there was not one of us from the middle class. We were all from blue-collar sweatshop backgrounds. And although he didn't attend the high school of his choice, Ortiz made the best of his situation and took classes in drafting, screen printmaking, and photography. After graduating from Industrial Arts High School in 1950, he got a job as a messenger in an architectural firm and took correspondence courses in advanced drafting. He enlisted in the Air Force when the Korean War broke out and was commissioned to analyze aerial photographs and maps for 2 years. And another issue that I found with a lot of the artists, the male artists that I interviewed at that time in the 60s, was that they were all war veterans. I mean, these were people who fought for this country and who came back really disillusioned. But at the same time, the one thing is that the GI Bill really enabled them to go to art school. And so that was, you know, one of the compromises that they made, because art school, at that time, it was much harder. It was probably as hard as today to get into art school and to get funding. You know, we're back to the 50s in terms of funding for artists and for students in general. So without that GI Bill, they would not have been able to go to school. Released from duty in 1953, Ortiz enrolled in the architecture program at Pratt Institute under the GI Bill. Ortiz was the only minority in the architecture department and gravitated to the fine arts department that had a more racially diverse population. In 1955, he switched from architecture to arts education, a program that he credits with giving him the intellectual tools to develop his theory and practice of destruction art. So it'll come back up, and we're going to see. That's, okay, it'll come back on. The arts education program compelled Ortiz to study developmental psychology and embark on a self-analysis of his creative process. During his years at Pratt, Ortiz confronted his childhood traumas and considered their effects on his personality and sense of identity as an artist. The summer vacations he spent in El Barrio as a boy. And what that is, I mean, if it were a little darker, is that that's a burned mattress. And I'm going to go into why he was burning mattresses and destroying pianos. I'm getting to the developmental psychology parts. See, I took that in for you. Milton now. You'll have to take his courses to really, I'm sure, learn more about developmental psychology, but it's super important. So what Ortiz remembers is that he spent his childhood in El Barrio, and for those of you who don't know, like New York, El Barrio is like Harlem, is largely a Puerto Rican neighborhood. And he thought that his vacationing there, staying over in the summers with his cousins was very formative. His cousins were members of a gang called the Turbans, and Ortiz recalls that the senseless violence he saw while in their company filled him with horror. Quote, "Those summers with my cousins were dangerous times. Very visceral and emotional stuff went on. Either we were chasing someone or running from a bunch of people. The big thing was going to cellars to hunt rats. The gangs involved violence and issues of maleness and macho-ness. It became clear to me that all this anger caused harm, and this is not the way I wanted to live my life." And that's one of the third things that I found in my research on all of these artists, is that practically everyone that I talked to from this time period up until like the late 60s were members of gangs. Gangs were an extremely important part of the formation of the social construction of living in the inner cities for young men. You could not survive without being in a gang. On the other hand, because people got used to gang life, it was very easy for people to switch that over into collective action, into a positive kind of situation. So everything has its plus and minuses. On the one hand, you're exposed to a lot of violence. On the other hand, if 2 or 3 people in your gang decide to make a difference in society, you have someone that you can run with and try and put that positive energy back in the community because you have that respect. So that's another thing that I found prevalent among these artists at that time, was gang membership. Ortiz's hot-tempered, ill-educated cousins represented the opposite of what he aspired to be, but they were nevertheless part of who he was. Ortiz understood that gang violence was an adaptive behavior to the sense of powerlessness that poor ethnic youth felt. While he abhorred the way his cousins expressed themselves, he nevertheless felt rage at the same societal forces that contained Puerto Ricans in a cycle of self-destruction. Quote, "I saw the disenfranchisement that made it so difficult for the underclass to have the abstract cognition to be objective about one's place in society. Art was a perfect environment to ventilate and arrive at some intelligence within which you vented all your angst, all your fears, and the resultant objects served to inform you and inform the culture seeing it." The intellectual leap that Ortiz took in the late 50s was to make a connection between his sense of confinement, of social confinement, as a minority artist, and the formal strictures that the early modernists faced. He took inspiration from the Dadaists and Surrealists who looked to non-Western cultures in search of alternate models of representing ideas and emotions that were taboo in Western society. During this period of intense study in the mid-1950s, Ortiz went to the Museum of Natural History and read copious anthropological and historical material on ritual worship and shamanism among African, Latin American, and Native American people. That's another thing that I found very prevalent among artists at this time. They did go to museums, but where they felt most at home was a Museum of Modern Art, where they could look at some objects in a museum case that reflected their ancestry, i.e., pre-Columbian stuff was there, African things were there, and so almost all of the artists, when I asked them what were the most influential art objects, they said, and what institutions did you go to all the time? They said, hands down, the American Museum of Natural History. Quote from Ortiz, quote, "I began to make a clear bridge between the European aesthetic framework from the 1860s to the 1920s and the whole indigenous aesthetic, the totemic and shamanistic body felt idea of creating, and the ideas that the European artists had about indigenous aesthetics through colonialism. And I brought all these objects to the Museum of Natural History, inspiring them to break free of classicism. By 1957, Ortiz developed what he called a shamanistic framework around which to destroy objects in a ritual manner. Using a Native American tomahawk, Ortiz would chop up Western cowboy films and put them in homemade medicine bags and then re-show them so that they didn't make any sense, you know? He also tore up mattresses, and that's a torn mattress, as a way to attack the psychological effects of racism that dwell in the unconscious. The mattress symbolizing the place where a subject comes in contact with their repressed thoughts during sleep. Now, one thing about Ortiz is that there were other artists like Robert Rauschenberg, for example, who were like taking things from the street and doing things like combines. There were other artists in Europe, Tingley, for example, Jean Tingley, who made these destructive machines. So curators, he actually had very early success. For example, that work right there is in the museum, is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. The Whitney also has also collected his work, but he never got to go to a commercial gallery. Like Leo Castelli, for example, who represented Robert Rauschenberg, went to a studio and just decided, I'm not going to represent you. So his career kind of stopped short. He had that little bit of success, which a lot of artists experience at the beginning. Somebody is discovering you, but other collectors are not buying you. And then all of a sudden it's like, you're not a good investment. Let's face it, for collectors. And that's been, again, an ongoing story of African American artists and Latino artists. You get a little bit of fame, a couple of people buy your work, and then nothing for years. Ortiz named the series of sculptures that resulted from his destruction rituals archaeological finds. Some of Ortiz's archaeological finds bear titles in homage to victims of the Holocaust and the bombing of Hiroshima. However, the cast-off furnishings, here's a piano destruction. Furnishings that Ortiz excavated in open lots more than likely belonged to poor African American and Puerto Rican families that were being displaced by urban renewal projects in the late 1950s and 60s. Quote, there was always a social concern, a politics that went into the pieces, stated Ortiz. I was interested in the cultural deconstruction of American values that was going on in the African American community and the relationship, and what that relationship would be to the Latino community. Certainly the pianos, and that's, again, the destruction ritual, that Ortiz began to ritually destroy in the 1960s should be seen within the context of the protests that arose around the building of Lincoln Center. Erected on the site of a working-class neighborhood, the Lincoln Center project dispersed hundreds of Puerto Rican families in the South Bronx and other areas of the city. Just as this underclass was sacrificed to build a temple to high culture, Ortiz saw his piano destruction rituals as a way for him to sacrifice an icon of high culture in pursuit of a liberation from materialism and class-racial oppression that led to social strife. Ortiz's desire to expand the mainstream art world's Eurocentric construction of vanguard art became enjoined to his work with education reform in the 1960s. Committed to fighting for social justice in the trenches, Ortiz never aspired to be the kind of artist who spent all his time in the studio. He held a day job as a teacher in music and art high school, because he was determined to be there, right? During the height of his career. And he responded with surprise to that he enjoyed teaching in the following manner, quote, what do you think I wanted to do all day? Sit around in my studio and order pizzas? How bourgeois. I got my master's from Pratt University in Arts Education in 1964, and I wanted to work. I wanted to make a difference. That's another sort of thread that you're going to see run more, I think, in the Puerto Rican artists and African American artists at that time. And that is that lots of people got into arts education. They were either pushed there because there were jobs there. People did not have that kind of trust fund to be staying home. Board of Education was hiring teachers, and that's where you went to get your day job. And practically, it's that and social work. Social work was also a very kind of prevalent career track that artists took because they were bilingual. People needed bilingual people to sit in the unemployment office, whatever, and that's how they made their money. It certainly wasn't through collectors. Ortiz took his role as the only Hispanic educator at the High School of Music and Art very seriously. In the late 1960s, the High School of Music and Art was located on West 135th Street and was part of School District 4, which covered all of East and West Harlem. Parents and students involved in the decentralization movement were waging a campaign to introduce Black and Puerto Rican history into the curriculum and redraw School District 4 in Upper Manhattan to give East Harlem residents greater control over their local schools. And this was, this was a point of contention because Blacks and Puerto Ricans worked together, on some things, and they were at each other's throats in the middle. The decentralization movement was very much part of a strategy of Puerto Ricans to get out from under Harlem and being controlled by African American politicians. They wanted to begin, on a regular basis, having control and having Puerto Ricans represent them. And so long as they were part of the Harlem district, African American politicians would always win. So, there was, the story is complex, and although people worked in coalition, they also had tremendous fights over the distribution of money and power at all times. So, when a group of students approached Ortiz to seek his help with adding jazz and African art to the course offerings in 1968 at the Music and Art High School, he became their champion on the faculty. The superintendent of District 4, Martin W. Frey, heard about Ortiz's activism at the High School of Music and Art and offered him a position designing a Puerto Rican cultural enrichment program for the school's district in the spring of 1969. Ortiz vividly recalls modifying the superintendent's suggestions. I said, no, not a program, a museum. We need a Museo del Barrio. When Ortiz conceived El Museo del Barrio as a community-based Puerto Rican museum, he clearly intended to bridge ethnic and disciplinary divides in the art world. Quote, the basic idea behind El Museo was to create a bridge between the fine and folk arts and make a bridge into the USA. You must remember that I was a fine artist and had works in the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney, so that was not outside my thinking, it was normal. Also at that time, the Studio Museum had been founded in 1968. And that, again, was another thing. Is if African Americans are having their own museum, then why don't we start our own in our community in East Harlem? So the Studio Museum was very much an impetus for Puerto Ricans to see that minorities can make it and can have a museum of their own. Again, a difference between the El Museo del Barrio and the Studio Museum was that the Studio Museum was aided by the Museum of Modern Art, by some trustees in the Museum of Modern Art. Number one, because they didn't want a Martin Luther King wing at the Museum of Modern Art. So, keep people quiet, they started that program in Harlem. And the Studio Museum, in comparison to El Museo del Barrio, began under much more auspicious circumstances. They had their own building. They had a board of trustees set up with a little bit of money. It was composed of artists and private collectors, and so there was a little bit more prestige from the very beginning attached to being at the Studio Museum in Harlem, rather than El Museo del Barrio, which was completely dependent in the beginning on funds from the education department, from the Board of Education. There were no private collectors. There was no interest among museums to help this museum get through. During his 2-year tenure as a founder and director of El Museo del Barrio, Ortiz became a major spokesperson for ethnic and racial minorities in the New York art world. He joined committees at the Art Workers Coalition to get African American and Puerto Rican artists in collections of mainstream museums. He organized exhibitions of Puerto Rican art and culture and was quoted extensively in the New York Times and Art in America. Fittingly, El Museo del Barrio was born in the public school.
I'm slow, man. you're working with a slow dude.
week we can do things like.
So it was really the Puerto Rican institutions that gave the first kinds of materials to El Museo del Barrio. That begins sometimes a very controversial relationship between the artists on the island trying to control what we do here in New York and trying to control the image of the museum from their side. So what Ortiz did was they received booklets and reproductions of pre-Columbian and Taíno art, Afro-Puerto Rican carnival masks. They got some of those wooden santos that represent the influence of Spanish Catholicism on the island, and Puerto Rican posters and graphics of the 1950s that represent sort of modern Puerto Rican art. So they got like a little package, a little like, sampler of what it is to have Puerto Rican art from the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture. The only problem is that historically the Institute for Puerto Rican Culture has privileged the island's Spanish and Native